Amen. In Matthew chapter 22, it says to us here at verse 34, "But when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. 'Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?' And he said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets.'" Now that's Jesus' answer to the question put to him. The question was put to him as a test. It's an opportunity to try to trip him up. Now the moment that we're in, if you're in Matthew chapter 22, Jesus has entered Jerusalem. We're in the final days before his arrest and the cross. We're approaching that moment, and the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the scribes and the leaders of all sorts are gathered together, and they didn't know that they're gathered, but they're gathered to assess him, to ask him questions, to test him, to see if he is who he says he is. That's not why, that was not what their invitation said, but that turns out to be what their purpose in Jerusalem is that week, is to test him and to find that they can find no fault in him. Are you still home? This question comes to him, and he answers out of Deuteronomy 6. Now, his first answer, his first statement as to what this commandment is, was exceedingly familiar to anyone in his hearing at that time, because for literally thousands of years, devout Jews everywhere have prayed twice a day, the prayer which is often called the Shema, which is the Hebrew word for one of the first words in the prayer, which includes this statement which Jesus makes, this particular command and exhortation from Deuteronomy chapter 6. Are you getting that? In the same way that people in Christian churches often are extremely familiar with the Lord's Prayer, and if you mentioned any part of it, if you use a phrase like, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us," or "Deliver us from evil," or "Our Father who art in heaven," any of those phrases, for anybody who's been a churchy person at some point in their life, they immediately conjure up the prayer that goes with them that those phrases appear in. Am I right? Well, if you were a Jew anywhere on the earth in the last 3,500 years, and somebody started to talk about the Lord our God is one God, you immediately know what they're talking about. You know what this is. You know how this ends. Are you hearing me? But then he adds a second piece that they didn't see coming, because it's not in Deuteronomy 6. It's in Leviticus 19. He's weaving together scriptures from different places, and he says, listen, you got to be right towards God, but part of being right towards God is treating God's creation right, treating His people right, looking at your neighbor in the right sort of way. Is this making some sense to you? And in fact, Dr. Homer Kent, who I'm pretty sure is somebody that you're not going to be familiar with, but Dr. Homer Kent has said in his commentary on this statement by Jesus, "Proper regard for God and one's neighbor is the essence of man's duty." Proper regard for God and one's neighbor is the essence of man's duty. And you might say, well, it doesn't seem like my neighbor and God are really in the same category, but here's the deal. Your neighbor matters to God, so what you do with your neighbor matters to God. Let me say that again. Your neighbor matters to God, so what you do with your neighbor matters to God. Now, all of these things are coming into play. This series that we're starting this year with, I've called it All, because he's talking about giving all to the Lord, loving Him with all your heart and all your soul, right? That was a weak yes, guys. God is all, and He only asks for all. Hello? He is. He's our all in all, and we like that part. We'll sing about that. And all He wants is all. He gave it all. We sing about that part. Are you guys still here? I love the alls when they apply to Him. It's when they apply to me that I struggle a little bit. But it's all. We're in an all relationship with our God, and that's the attention which Jesus is drawing here in this statement, and that's the pointedness of this contact. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and that connects to you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If you're really doing the first one, the second one isn't going to be a challenge to you. And these two, he says, on these two commandments, these two sayings depend the whole law and the prophets. Now, we're told by the scholars that at this point in history, rabbis had identified 613 commands that they thought that we all had to follow. And they're testing Jesus by asking him, which one's the most important one? You got 613 to choose from, and you better not be wrong because we've got an advocate for every one of them. Each one of them has a personal advocate here in the crowd listening to you today who's going to be offended if you don't pick their command. We've got specialists who've written a 6-part book series and small group study series on each one of these commandments, and if you don't like theirs best, they're going to be upset. It's got quiet again. And that's they're here, and they throw it out there, and he says, listen, I can tell you what the command that the others hang on is. You got to love God with everything. And one of the ways that manifests is how you treat each other. And he says that's the whole deal. All the law and the prophets, the whole of the Old Covenant, every word from Genesis to Malachi hangs on these two statements. Has that got our attention? So, recognizing that I said a moment ago, he's quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 6 and Leviticus chapter 19. Over the course of our time together these next weeks, we're going to spend a little bit of time in each of them, and we're going to study some specific aspects of them. But let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and read what it is that Jesus is quoting there, if you will. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, it says, beginning at verse 4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. What's his point? He says, don't you ever forget this stuff. This is who you are. This is an identity statement. This is how we remember who we are, and when we're called to ourselves, when we come to ourselves. You remember the man that we call the prodigal son. There's a moment in that text in Luke's gospel where he comes to himself, which is to say, what he's been doing, he thinks he's expressing his true essence, following his real passion, doing his thing, spending his inheritance, living the life he wants to live, but he wasn't himself. But he comes to himself. There's a moment where it's like the light goes on and he says, what am I doing? This is not who I am. In my Father's house, slaves have better lives than this. I'm going home. Right? Isn't that what he does? Well, here for Israel for all time is a way to shake yourself and come to yourself. These are the words. And he's saying, keep them around you all the time. Remind yourself of them throughout your day. Teach them to the people around you. Write them where you're going to see them. Make sure that you are constantly, every time you pass through a doorway, remember why that little thing is there and what that means to you. This is an identity statement. I want you to not forget this. This is who you are. Teach them to your children. Teach them to your children. Teach them to your children. Are we home? You know, it's a funny thing to me. People will say, you know, I want my children to make their own choices. Well, you don't have to want them to. They're going to. But, you know, I don't know anybody who says, I've never tied my kids' shoes, but I do put shoes near them once in a while to see if they'll respond to them. Are you home? This is free. You can lighten up. I'm serious. I remember being taught, I remember the first time I tied my shoes on my own without my parents there coaching me. I remember exactly where I was, kneeling beside our apartment house in a suburb of Chicago when I bent over and I was playing with my friends. I think we were playing tag or something. I was hiding. I didn't want to have to go in the house to get my shoe tied, and I was panicked because I'm in the middle of this game, and if I have to leave where I am, I'm going to be in trouble. My shoe is untied. I don't want to go in the house, and I've been learning, I've been practicing, but I've always had to have somebody there coaching me. And I'm getting ready to do this, and I did it, and it worked. It was a great moment. It's on my highlight reel. But my parents had been putting my shoes on me for years at that point. They'd been tying them in front of me for years. They'd been trying to get me to tie them for myself. They weren't saying, well, we just want him to be free to make his own choices. We don't want to interfere with anything. If he doesn't like shoes, we can't help that. They're like, you're going to wear shoes, and we're going to tie them. And this was before Velcro was on everything. In fact, this was before Velcro was invented, I think. And we didn't have zippers. We didn't have Velcro. We didn't have 100 ways for shoes. Shoes tied. And so it wasn't a question of whether we're going to teach him to tie his shoes. The question was, when are we going to teach him? He's going to do this thing. So what I'm trying to say in a long sort of way is, my parents tied my shoes for me, then they tied my shoes with me, then they watched me tie my shoes, then they told me to tie my shoes. This was the history of my life. They were very narrow about that. They had no room for other options. This was going to happen this way. When I left their house, I never had to tie my shoes again if I didn't want to. But while I was there, this was how it was going to be. Are you home? God is saying to Israel, in your house, these are the words you teach. These are the things you say. This is the message you deliver. When you sit down, when you stand up, when you go to bed, when you wake up, when you're eating, when you're with your children, this is what you teach them. This is what we put in their head. This is what we give them to ponder and consider. Yes? And it begins with this outstanding statement, "Hear, O Israel." Hear. And specifically, I told you earlier that in Hebrew, the word that is used to describe this little prayer, and the part of it that's the prayer is just the beginning. You say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." That is the Shema. You don't have to ever remember the word. You don't have to care about whether you spell it with an E or an A, because it depends on which Hebrew dictionary you're looking in, because there aren't E's or A's, there's Hebrew letters. But are you home? You don't have to recognize that word, but we know that it's called that because the first word, "hear," is a translation of the Hebrew word Shema. And it's a bigger word than the English word "hear," because it's a little more akin to when I say, "Did you hear me?" Well, what are you, 8 feet away from me? How could you not hear me unless you're not hearing? But what do we mean when I say, "Did you hear me?" We don't mean, are your eardrums vibrating? I'm pretty sure your eardrums were vibrating, but I'm asking the question, what? Did I have your attention? Are you listening to me? And this word is a very big word in the Hebrew language, which describes to us not just the physical function of hearing, which it is the word for, but the whole process of listening, understanding, and receiving what's being said. Are you getting that? It's defined this way. It can also mean to pay attention to or to focus on. I'm not going to go through 20 different examples of how it's used in the Old Testament, but there's a lot of them. In the King James Version of the Bible, there are 785 times this word is translated "hear." There are 196 times where it's translated "hearken," which, if you think about the Old English word hearken, it means to listen, paying attention, right? Almost 200 times it's translated that way, but I got to get the number right. What's the number? Where'd it go? I made a lumpy number. I think that's an 89. 89 times in the King James Version of the Bible in the Old Testament, it's translated obey. You think that doesn't have anything to do with here. No, you're mistaken. Obey always begins with here, and here is supposed to end with obey. Let me say that again. Obey always begins with here, and here is supposed to end with obey. And so, many times when we see this word, it's not simply saying hear, it's saying listen to obey. When it's talking to us, or in some cases, and particularly when we're talking to God, it's saying listen to respond. The Psalms are full of, hear my cry, O Lord. I don't mean simply be aware of the auditory noise I'm making, but listen to me to respond to me, is what we're saying when we say, hear my cry, O Lord, right? That's what we're calling out for. That's that moment. And think how many times in the Psalms do we see that plea, hear me. The Lord heard me. I rejoice because the Lord heard me. He doesn't just mean I rejoice because the sound of the syllables I was speaking came into the Lord's ears. He means I rejoice because the Lord paid attention to what I said. Are you still with me? Hear. The whole thing begins with hear. God's cry to His people, listen to obey. It begins with listen to obey. Now we're talking about the Hebrew language in the Old Testament, but you understand when we come into the Gospels in the New Testament, what do we begin to encounter? We begin to encounter over and over and over again, when you read the red letters, Jesus talks about hearing. He's not using this same Hebrew word, but he's talking about hearing. And so many times by the context we understand he's not simply talking about the physical function of hearing, but he's talking about listening with an intention to grasp it. How many times does he close a statement with, he who has ears to hear, let him hear? Which, if we're simply talking about physical function, is redundant and ridiculous. But he's saying something deeper using simple words we use all the time, isn't he? I imagine almost everybody present when he says that has an ear on either side of their head, and in most cases those ears are working fine. He's not talking about the function of their ears. He's talking about whether or not they're within themselves paying attention to what their ears are telling them and receiving what he's saying. And I'm suggesting that we begin this year with a conscious effort to hear the Lord, to listen, to obey, to position ourselves intentionally so that I'm not just listening to evaluate because I'm the one who wants to be on the throne and I believe that it's my place to pick and choose what God says is going to happen, but I'm listening to obey with the understanding that what you say is what's going to happen, sir. Say on. I'm receiving orders and I'm not making choices. I made my choice. And now I take direction. Are you home? Hear, O Israel. Hear. Hear the cry of the Lord to you. Is that making a little bit of sense to you? In fact, I told you that it can mean in the Hebrew language, listen to obey. There's 89 times that it's translated obey or obedient in the Old Testament in the King James Version. But there actually, I am told by Hebrew scholars, there is no direct word for obey in ancient Hebrew. That this is the word they would use. You listen to obey. Because without the listening, there's no obeying. We listen to obey. Everybody still glad you came? In the Gospel of John, when Jesus starts to talk, as he does in some of those middle chapters, about God hearing prayer, or we begin to see the Gospel itself talking about prayers being heard, we're not just talking about God having the physical capability of hearing the prayer. We're talking about His being attentive to it, His paying attention and listening to respond, yes? So it matters to us that God hears me. Does it matter to me that I hear God? Well, sitting here this morning, we're going to say yes, but the way we live tomorrow is going to say more about whether we meant that yes than whether or not we say yes right now. Did you get that? I mean, in this context, what are we going to say? Oh, yes, it matters to me to hear from God. But then the way that I live my life, the way that I order my steps, the way I start my day, the way that I end my day, the way that I motor through my day, what I do in the middle of my night is all going to be a response to whether I mean yes or whether I simply said yes because in this context it was awkward not to. Are we home? And so, yes is not simply a word which lives in my mouth. It becomes the life that I live out here. Is that a yes? You're thinking about it. All right, we'll roll with that. Oh man, so much to do. I knew when I was working on this that this was going to be a all morning, all afternoon, and on into the evening kind of message. But you did bring the bag lunch, right? Yes, good. And we won't be multiplying the loaves and the fishes later. So we are going to find a point to dismiss here this morning, but there's an awful lot to be done where this is concerned. But I did want to visit one psalm just as an illustration of what I was saying about the psalms, and that would be 143. There's a lot of psalms to pick from. We could literally spend many different services just in the psalms looking at what they have to say about this, but I wanted to look at a psalm here, and then I wanted to mention a few more of the New Testament connections to this idea of hearing with an intentionality attached to it. And then I think I want to look at how Jesus is teaching us that in one particular example. But in Psalm 143, it begins right off the bat at verse 1. Hear my prayer, O Lord. Give ear to my supplication. Answer me in your faithfulness, in your righteousness. So that statement, hear my prayer, he's using exactly the same word that God uses towards Israel when he says, hear, O Israel. And it's that hear, and again, we're not telling God to hear to obey, but we're saying listen to respond. I'm asking for your attention here because I don't simply want you to hear the words I'm saying. I want you to consider them and respond to them. And that's the cry of the psalmist. That's the Spirit of God crying out for us through this psalmist, hear my prayer, O Lord. And do we pray when we don't care? I pause for a moment. That wasn't intended to be a trick question. The answer is supposed to be no. Right? I don't just pray to pray. I don't just pray to make noise. I don't just pray to check it off my to-do list. I don't just pray because it makes me feel better about myself. Why do I pray? If I have no sense of connection to who I'm talking to, I'm not praying. Now, there are those who do, but I'm not praying if I have no sense of connection to who I'm talking to. When I pray, it's intentional. It's communication. I'm talking to God. I'm not just checking things off my list. This isn't something I do to impress my friends. Yes? That was 4 of us. That's pretty good. Prayer is not something that makes us feel good about ourselves. It's not a religious duty. It's an open invitation from the God who made us. Why wouldn't we use it? It's your phone a friend lifeline. Use it. There's no point in finishing it with it still in your toolbox. Use it. And so that's the cry here at verse 1. But let's look at a slightly different second context here in the same prayer. At verse 8, he declares, let me hear your loving kindness in the morning, for I trust in you. Teach me the way in which I should walk, For to you I lift up my soul. Now, what is this part of this prayer speaking of? He says, listen, when he says, let me hear your loving kindness, he doesn't just mean I want to hear it rustling in the bushes near me. He's saying, let me hear in order to obey your loving kindness, your covenantal faithfulness, your chesed for me. Let me hear that. Let me be listening and attentive to it so that I am prepared to receive commands from your loving kindness. Because what else is he saying? For I trust in you. Teach me the way in which I should walk. He's crying out for instruction with an intentionality of obeying it. And the passion which is coming forth here is speaking to each of us. We have, every one of us, had that passion. Whether we've expressed it like this, whether we've submitted to pray is a whole different issue. But we've all had that moment where we've thought, I want to hear your covenant calling me. I want to hear you teaching me how to walk. I'm tired of trying to get this right on my own. I need you to tell me what needs to be done and lead me in it. And that's what the psalm is declaring here. He's not simply saying, I want to hear it. He's saying, I want to hear in order to obey. Yes? And so that's the picture that we come to. Now I said, the New Testament does not have the same connection between the Greek word for hear and the Greek understanding of obey. But we see in the New Testament situation after situation where the people speaking are connecting the word hear with the idea of obedience and action. We see that in Revelation chapter 2 and 3, where each of these instructions is concluded with, let him who has an ear hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Again, the people they're addressing almost all have ears, and ears that work fine. He's not saying those of you with hearing. He's saying those of you with understanding, those of you with a heart which cries out for these things, those of you which hunger and thirst after righteousness, hear what the Spirit is saying. Right? And so that declaration goes out. In John chapter 10, when Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice, do you think he simply means they're within earshot? Or do you think he means it means something to them when they hear my voice? It isn't just a sound, it has meaning and connects with understanding and longing in them. And because there is understanding and longing in them which takes that sound and causes it to have meaning, even though they're just sheep, they come. Because there's something in them that says that sound isn't just a sound, it moves me to action. They hear my voice. In Mark chapter 8, when Jesus and the boys are walking, it says the disciples are discussing amongst themselves that they've forgotten to bring bread. And so they're confused. Or, excuse me, they're not confused, they're concerned. Then Jesus makes a comment about the leaven of the Pharisees. And the boys, because they're totally focused on themselves and their failure, I know that doesn't speak to any of us, but because they're obsessed with themselves and what they're sure everybody else can see about them that embarrasses them, Jesus speaks to them about the leaven of the Pharisees, and they start saying to each other, he said that because we forgot the bread. He's trying to make us feel bad. He's pointing out our shortcomings. He's picking on us. Right? You're all looking at me very soberly. That's literally what they're looking at each other. They are so self-conscious about their forgetting the bread that they're not even hearing what he's saying. They're hearing what they're thinking. And he talks to them, you guys, you don't hear. It's a hearing issue. It's not an ear issue, it's an understanding issue. We see the same kind of situation in a slightly different context in Matthew chapter 18, where we're talking about conflict resolution. And we're saying if I have something against my brother and he doesn't respond to me, if he doesn't hear me, then what am I going to do? I'm going to take him to it. I'm going to bring somebody with me. And if he doesn't hear us, what am I going to do? I'm going to talk to the church. And if he doesn't hear them, we're talking about hear each time. The word for hear, Jesus says hear, but we're not talking about somebody who doesn't have their ears turned on. We're talking about somebody who doesn't have their brain connected to their ears. They're not hearing what they're being told. And we have an escalating plan of how we're going to approach somebody who's not hearing what's being said to them. It's not an auditory problem. It's a heart and head problem. Are you still home? And that's exactly where it lands. And in Luke chapter 16, it's a long story there in Luke chapter 16. I don't want to deal with all of it, but we have the story of the rich man and Lazarus who both die, and the rich man finds himself in hell, and he's looking across to Abraham's bosom, and he sees Lazarus, and he's crying out, let him come over here and give me a drink. And then says, well, if you won't let him give me a drink, then how about if we send him to my brothers to warn them not to be as stupid as we've all been, and all that stuff, right? And what does it end up saying? Abraham says to him near the end of that story that Jesus is teaching, he says, they have Moses, they have the law and the prophets. If they don't hear them, they won't hear even one back from the dead. Lazarus showing up unexpectedly on their doorstep is not going to get them to pay more attention than they're willing to pay to God's word given to them. But again, when he says they don't hear them, he's not talking about physically hearing Moses. He's talking about whether or not we're receiving what's being said there. It's a listen to obey. And when it comes to listening to each other, how you listen to me and how I listen to you is not of any special concern in this moment. But how we listen to God is critical. And the choice that we need to make, the choice that we want to make together this morning, is that I'm going to spend this season of my life listening to obey. Listening to obey. Purposeful intention. Focusing myself to purpose what God is saying as my new assignment. I'll give you a couple more definitive statements on that while we're giving that consideration. W.E. Vine says concerning the Hebrew word here that it means to agree with the intention or petition of the statement. To agree with the intention or petition of the statement. In defining the word, Strong says it's to hear intelligently, often with the implication of attention, obedience, etc. That's the call that I'm putting out this morning is let's listen to obey. Let's listen to obey. Let's be a people committed to giving our all to Him who is all as we listen to obey. We find that is exactly what Solomon is commended for. You know, people so often the story of Solomon is misunderstood and misrepresented. He didn't accidentally pick the magic door which gets him all the prizes. What he did was he responded to God in his life. In that story, which is in 1 Kings, probably chapter 3. But you know what's happening in that story as it transpires is God comes to this young king who has just suddenly come to the throne and says to him, "What is there that I can give that you would want?" And he says, "I want," and what he literally says is a hearing heart. A lot of translations try to make that a little easier for us to grasp, and they'll call it something like an understanding heart. But if you check the footnote, the margin usually says hearing. It's literally hearing. He says, "I want a hearing heart that I may judge your people well." What does he ask for? You see, and sometimes we teach that like, you see, if you ever get the chance, if you ever just walking along, there's a burning bush, and the bush says to you, you got a wish, make a wish. What do you want? You're all looking at me very soberly. Don't ask for money. Don't ask for health. Don't ask for long life. Ask for wisdom. It's the secret word. The others come with it. Have we ever, I mean, I know I'm exaggerating, but have you ever heard Solomon's story told like that? It's not that everybody needs to ask for wisdom because it's the secret word, like Groucho Marx with the duck dropping down, you know. There's a reference that's out of time for you. But the point here is, what is Solomon's assignment? Here is a young fellow feeling overwhelmed with his responsibility, and when the Spirit of God comes to him and says, what would you like? He doesn't ask for something for himself. He asks for something for his assignment. He says, I've got to have a heart which listens to obey so that I can discern and judge the right choices for your people. Because otherwise, I'm going to fail as a king and stand before you ashamed at the end of my life. And I don't want that to happen. So I'm not asking for stuff to make me happy or a shiny car to impress my friends. I'm asking for something that I'll need to obey your calling in my life. And that's the reason. The Scripture tells us very plainly, that's the reason that God says to him, because you didn't ask for something for yourself, I'm giving you stuff for yourself. You not only are going to have a heart which can sort and discern and obey, but you're also going to have the stuff you didn't ask for. You're going to be rich. You're going to have a long life. That's going to happen. But you asked for the right thing because your priorities said, serving you is what matters to me, sir, and I feel unequipped to serve you well. That was Solomon's prayer. That's what he's asking for. A discerning, understanding heart which listens to obey. He says a hearing heart. He's not simply asking for the capability of detecting God's voice. He's asking for a heart which is inclined towards what God is telling him and wants to receive it. Are you getting that? And so, that's the picture. Now, if you'll join me in Matthew chapter 13, we're going to wind down. Is God on the job? So, yes. In Matthew chapter 13, we find Jesus teaching the parable of the sower here. And for the moment, I'm going to presume that many of us have read the actual parable. It appears in verses 3 through 8, and then he finishes at verse 9 saying, "He who has ears, let him hear." And I'm going to say again, in my estimation, that phrasing suggests that he's talking about this Old Testament conception of hearing as a listen to obey kind of thing. And so he makes this statement out there, and then he says, if you've got ears, hear this thing. And the disciples came and said to him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" And Jesus answered them, "To you it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been granted. For whoever has, to him more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has shall be taken away from him." Now this will become more clear as we read on, but I want you to begin to grasp that at verse 12, he's not making this statement in a broad general sense about everything. It's got a specific application in its context, and the has that he's saying some people have, right? He says to him that has. Who are the people who have in the context he's talking about? His disciples. What do they have? The thing that they have is a hunger and a thirst for righteousness, which has caused them to listen, to obey. They're paying attention. And he says, when you pay attention, you're given even more. Your understanding keeps growing. You see with wiser eyes. You grasp more and more. Are you getting that? But if you don't have, even what little you thought you have gets taken from you. And he says, when I'm teaching the crowd, I'm teaching in a way which is sorting them out. They're sorting themselves by how they're listening. The words are going out there. They're all hearing the words, but a lot of them aren't hearing the words. Is that okay? So at verse 13 he says, therefore, because of that statement at verse 12, which is so central to the way that he operates, therefore I speak to them in parables, because while seeing, they do not see, and while hearing, they do not hear, nor do they understand. In their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is being fulfilled, which says, you will keep on hearing, but will not understand. You will keep on seeing, but will not perceive. For the heart of this people has become dull. Who is that responsibility on in this context? When we read that, is Jesus, who is, you're all looking at me like this is a trick question again. They've let their hearts become dull. They've missed their first assignment. What is the first and greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart. What have they done? They've allowed their hearts to become dull. And he says, for the heart of this people has become dull. This is Isaiah speaking, Jesus quoting for us, yes? For the heart of this people has become dull. With their ears they scarcely hear. And they've closed their eyes, otherwise they would see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and return, and I would heal them. Do you see that the last part of this passage is saying that God stands ready for anyone who repents? He has not assigned them a dull heart. They have chosen a dull heart. And He stands there saying, if you will open your eyes, if you will open your ears, if you will stop what is taking you down the wrong path, I stand ready to heal you. I am here. Am I making this stuff up, or is that what it says? He says they've closed their eyes, otherwise they would see with their eyes, they would hear with their ears, and they would understand with their heart and return, and I would heal them. If it were not for them closing themselves, they would return, and I would heal them. But so he says, Jesus goes on, he says, but blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. Pause for a moment again. Everybody in the multitude, for the most part, has eyes that see and ears that hear. But he's saying to the disciples, I'm not talking about the function, the mechanical function of your eyes and ears. I'm talking about what you're doing with your heart. And you've started down the right path. And let me say to each of us today, we've started down the right path, but we always have the opportunity to become dull of heart. Any one of us can choose to be just as foolish as Isaiah was saying those people were. But we need to consciously choose and continually choose that I want to see and I want to hear and I purpose to listen, to obey. Is that the people that we are? He says, but blessed are your eyes because they see and your ears because they hear. For truly I say to you that many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see and did not see it, and to hear what you hear and did not hear it. This day, as he stands there proclaiming, is a day which many looked forward to and never saw. This moment where we stand in covenant with God, born of His Spirit, joint heirs with Jesus Christ, is a moment which many prophets and righteous men looked for and never saw. And we stand here with this great blessing, with this huge opportunity. And now the question that's here is, what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do having been given so great a gift? Yes? He's got an explanation for them. He says, "Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom." Now, he's been using the word "hear" in a particular way for some time in this conversation, hasn't he? Do you think he's still using it the same way? I think he is. He's not simply saying if you're within hearing of the word of the kingdom. He's saying if you are paying some attention, if you have given a little bit of understanding, if you have oriented yourself towards the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is the one on whom seed was sown beside the road. He says, listen, you've got an enemy who always wants to take from you what you haven't got a firm grip on. Keep a grip on it. Keep a grip on it. When you go to New York City or you go to Boston, you don't leave your phone laying around somewhere near you. You don't leave your car keys within sight, do you? Am I talking to the right bunch? What do? You act like the country bumpkin, don't you? I'll put that in here, zip this shut, tie around it. Right? Got a little packet around my neck and send it down to the street. I know, I'm not literally, but you know what I'm saying. I mean, you're more attentive to where your phone is, to where your keys are. Why? Because you're in the big city. You're in the big city. Wyndham Center is not where pickpockets hang out. But Manhattan is. Well, in this world, I have an adversary. And I can't afford to just hang lightly, casually onto the things that matter to me. Because when I do, they get taken from me. Are you still home? He says, listen, verse 20, the one on whom seed was sown on the rocky places, this is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary. And when affliction or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he falls away. And the one on whom the seed was sown among thorns, this is the man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. And the one on whom seed was sown on the good soil, this is the man who hears the word and understands it, and indeed bears fruit and brings forth some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. He's talking about how we listen. And he's saying when we listen, we then have to take that and weave it together with something inside of us so that it's attached. And if I'm going to pray and ask for direction, I'm not going to do that casually. I'm going to be planning to listen, to obey. And when I hear, I'm not going to hear casually like the side of the road or the stony soil. I'm not going to hear casually like the weed bed. I'm going to hear like that last guy who's listening to understand, and the words that come to me are going to become, they're moving right to the top of my to-do list. And they're becoming my orders for the day because they're being united with understanding in me. They're being woven together with something in me so that now I've got a grip on them to where they're not going to be taken from me. And God is looking to lead me by His Spirit that I might be a son indeed and answer His call. I told you twice a day, every day, devout Jews the world over have been saying, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The Lord is one." Calling themselves to listen, to obey to the Lord who made us. Amen? Shall we stand up together? Did God get some work done today? I'm going to take a moment here and read to you from the 10th chapter of the book of Romans, where it says to us in the 9th and the 10th verses that if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised Him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart a person believes, resulting in righteousness, and with the mouth he confesses, resulting in salvation. I'm going to take a moment. I'm going to start my new year celebrating that Jesus Christ is Lord, and that I do believe in my heart that God the Father has raised him from the dead, and that I'm prepared to give testimony to that, because I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I know that it's God's power unto salvation to all those who believe, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, because in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, because the righteous, the just, shall live by faith. Is that good news to anybody? So I'm going to invite you, if you would like to, you can join me in that celebration and make that declaration. And if you're saying, I'm not sure I've ever done that, this would be something new for me, I'm wondering if I even qualify or if that's appropriate, the answer very simply is this. The Spirit of God draws us, and He draws us largely through the Word, because faith comes by hearing, and hearing by God's Word, the Word of Jesus Christ and who He is. And as we hear these things, as we've heard today, the Spirit of God stands ready, saying, do you want to believe? Believe. You can believe. Here's believing. Take a hold of believing. And sometimes we're not familiar with that. We don't recognize exactly what that is, but that's that moment, that awkwardness, that sense that maybe I should, but I don't know. That's the step that we want to take across that chasm and say, yes, I will do this thing. And enter into this. And so we make this proclamation. So I'm going to pray, and you may join me if you would like to, and we can celebrate together. Dear God, I thank you for hearing me today. I do believe in my heart that you've raised Jesus from the dead. And I proclaim with my own mouth, Jesus Christ is Lord. I thank you, Father, for this new life, for your Holy Spirit, for speaking to me, so that I can listen to obey.